When I was a newly ordained rabbi, the worship war, as I called it, plagued historic congregations like ours with a multi-generational membership. Longtime members were devoted to services as they had always been, meaning for a few decades. At the same time, Jewish teens and young adults wanted their synagogue services to feel more like the worship experiences that had moved their spirits at camp. Sometimes the conflict was harsh. In 1992, when I arrived in San Antonio, the music was intoned by 4 singers clad in black robes and accompanied by an organ. The singers were hired professionals, not Jewish or members of the temple community. Some openly mocked them, which was exceedingly unkind to skilled singers who were only doing what they were employed to do. Then, if a service followed a different style using a guitar and more Hebrew, longtime members would complain that they were robbed of their temple. Some even claimed that more Hebrew in worship would, quote, take us back to Poland, to a primitive condition before the advent of reform. During my rabbinical school years, I fought my own worship war with my maternal grandmother. Twin boys who'd been campers of mine were preparing for their B'nai Mitzvah at our temple. They intended to wear kippah talit, head covering and prayer shawl, which were not customary at our Houston congregation. As a member of the congregation's ritual and music committee, my grandmother infamously proclaimed, "They can wear their talis and yarmulke if they want. Beth Yeshurun, the conservative synagogue, is right down the street." When the rabbi generously invited me to offer a Friday night sermon, I repaid his kindness by lecturing all assembled, notably including my grandmother. I explained that we practice reform, not reformed Judaism. The process of reform, I explained, was not one and done. We are consistently adapting our worship practice to balance fidelity to our heritage with the needs of each generation. If we insisted on doing things the way they had always been done, we would simply be establishing a new orthodoxy. Deuteronomy does just that, particularly in this week's portion. Earlier in the Torah, we learned that Sukkot, Passover, and Shavuot were observed in all the communities where the Israelites lived. In this week's portion, by contrast, we read that festival sacrifices were to be made only at the temple in Jerusalem. Deuteronomy was written to support a reform instituted by Josiah, king of Judea in the 7th century BCE. Josiah sought to unify the kingdom and steer the people away from idolatry by requiring that all Israelites bring their sacrifices to Jerusalem, the capital city. The biblical book of 2 Kings extols Josiah's righteous rule, arguing, for example, that he reestablished the observance of Passover after the festival had been neglected for some 4 centuries. The kingdom of Israel, north of Judea, had been conquered by the Assyrians. Idolatry was rampant. At least some of the priests scattered across the kingdom had given in to people's lust for idolatry. Josiah's reform preserved our tradition into another generation, enabling its later transmission to us, to billions of Jews, Christians, and Muslims worldwide. At the same time, sacrificial worship of Adonai would be reclassified as Adonai if not carried out in the Jerusalem temple. That worship would be suspended for a half-century when the Babylonians destroyed the temple in 586 BCE, and it would come to an end when the Romans demolished the temple in 70 CE. Our Talmudic sages instituted tefillah bimkom avodah, prayer in the place of sacrificial worship. The offerings of our lips would replace sacrifices from the herds, flocks, and fields. You might think then that the Talmud lays out specifics about how these prayers were to be conducted. That is, how Jews in every land and in every age ought to worship. However, in the 9th century, a Jewish community in Spain sent a question all the way to Babylon to Rabbi Amram Gaon, asking about the order of the Jewish worship service. Amram did not respond by telling these Spanish Jews that they were ignoramuses, that everybody should know the well-established ritual for Jewish worship. Instead, he sent them a detailed response, the first Jewish prayer book on record. Across the next millennium, various segments of the Jewish world established a variety of ways of worshiping, all based on Amram's prayer book. Over time, rituals evolved, developing differently from place to place, century to century. Only in the 1800s, with the advent of Reform Judaism, did anybody realize that they were changing worship. Responding to Reform, Orthodox Judaism was established with the principle, innovation is prohibited by the Torah. Specifically, a rabbi named the Khatam Sofer wrote that praying in a language other than the Holy Tongue, that is Hebrew, is completely impermissible. The Khatam Sofer was forced to admit that Talmudic sages had permitted prayer in other languages, but he insisted, with scant evidence, that they only intended that permission to be temporary. This week's portion demonstrates that the Khatam Sofer was mistaken. Far from being forbidden, innovation is a characteristic of the Torah. Josiah instituted new regulations about worship, and our people have been innovating ever since. Our service tonight has resembled long-standing practice at Congregation B'nai Israel, depending, of course, on one's definition of long-standing. On Shabbat mornings in the library, our worship style looks nothing like what we do on most Friday nights in the sanctuary. Moreover, Cantor Dubov and the Ronell Fund have empowered us to explore Jewish spirituality as it is emerging and growing today. Last week, for example, we meditated musically with the psalms traditionally associated with Kabbalat Shabbat, welcoming the Sabbath. 4 years ago, in the depths of the pandemic, as we planned for the High Holy Days in ways we had never imagined, my teacher, Rabbi Larry Hoffman, Professor Emeritus of Liturgy at Hebrew Union College, encouraged my colleagues and me to let go of many of the rules we had been taught, some of them by him, as we designed meaningful worship in unprecedented circumstances. He gave us permission to skip some prayers we might have been taught as essential to every worship service, a flexibility he urged us to embrace even after returning in person. Judaism has been enriched and preserved in every age by priests, prophets, and sages, rabbis, cantors, and lay leaders who have declined to be stuck in the way we've always done it. All have sung traditional words to new melodies and revised the words to ancient tunes, making our tradition come alive in every age. Let us embrace innovation and experimentation, mindful of the psalmist's urging, Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash, sing unto Adonai a new song. Then may the Holy One hear our prayers and find them pleasing. Amen.